E ho mai kai ke mai luna e. O na mea puna no e au na mele. E ho mai, e ho mai, e ho mai, e ho mai kai ke mai luna e. O na mea puna no e au na mele. E ho mai, e ho mai, e ho mai, e ho mai, kai e mai luna mai e. O na mea puna no e au, o na mele. E ho mai, e ho mai, e ho mai e.
Thank you. For those of you that might need seats, the front row's open.
Will you introduce Grace?
Yeah. Anybody want to move up? People in the back want to come closer where you can see? Don't be shy. Come on. Come on. There's plenty of spaces up here. Do you need me to advance slides? No. Okay, well, our keynote speaker today is Dr. Grace Klinges, and she is with Akoakoa Foundation, Coral Reef Restoration Foundation. Grace has an extensive history of coral reef knowledge, coral reef resilience, especially how we remember when we were talking about learning about ridge to reef, coral reefs, and threats to coral reefs. So we brought in an expert for you guys to learn from and figure out, and maybe it's a path you want to go. So thank you, Grace.
Thank you, Kater. Thank you guys for having me. What a privilege to get to hang out with you guys today and learn what you all have been working on with your VUET experiences. Kater asked me to say a few words about how I came to be in the position I'm in. And I feel like you guys have such a head start because when I was your age, I didn't even think I wanted to be a scientist. I lived from New Jersey. I'm from an area very, very far from the tropics. I had no idea I wanted to study this. And there's been a lot of luck in my life, a lot of serendipity, and I found myself here. And I think my mana'o is to bring what I've learned working in coral restoration for many years. I worked in Florida, where maybe you guys have heard, but the reefs in Florida are in really bad shape. And I think it's my responsibility to bring what I learned trying to fix the reefs in that, very rough shape to the reefs here, which are in much better shape because of the care your community has given to taking care of those corals. But we still have a responsibility to continue caring for those corals. So I wanted to talk to you all a little bit today about all of the stresses that corals are under and how the things that we do day to day can influence their health. So this is going to be super review for most of you guys, but how many of you know what a coral is? Which one of these things is it? Is it a plant, an animal, or a rock? Just call it out.
Technically all.
Technically all. River's right.
Nice.
So corals are technically animals, but they have a little bit of each of those three components in it, and we're going to talk a little bit about that today. But we consider them animals. The coral itself is an animal. And is a coral a vertebrate or an invertebrate?
Invertebrate.
Invertebrate, that's right. So corals do not have backbones. Like fish have backbones, like we have backbones. Corals are really simple animals. And corals are colonial animals. Corals exist as a colony made up of thousands of little tiny polyps. And each of these polyps that you see here is a ring of tentacles surrounding a mouth. And they're kind of like tiny anemones. So you guys maybe have seen Finding Nemo, where Nemo lives inside of that anemone. Corals are like little tiny shrunken down anemones. And you can easily recognize coral out on the reef by sometimes you see what looks like a rock, but it's got these little tiny tentacles coming out of the rock. And those tentacles, as we're going to talk about, are one of the things that helps the coral feed. So we know what a coral is, but what is a coral reef? Well, coral reef is essentially a group of many corals, a structure built by corals over thousands of years. And coral reefs are essential to provide habitat for fish, for other sea creatures, and the lemur that we all depend on for food, and for some of us, our jobs. And all living things have very specific conditions that they need to live on. For us, we need food, we need like roofs over our heads, but coral have very specific conditions that they need. So corals need clean and relatively warm water. We don't see coral living in cold places like New Jersey. They need fish to help eat the algae, the lemur that grows on the reef, and that's to keep that relationship in balance. If no fish are eating the lemur, then the lemur is going to outcompete the koa. The coral actually need food to eat. They are an animal, even though they look like a rock. They do need some food in the water to eat. And they need calm seas. And here in Hawaii, this is sometimes a problem for the coral. We have very big wave events in the winter that give us our surf, but they can also stress the coral out and damage the coral physically. So the coral generally like pretty calm seas. And the corals are very particular. They also need, just like all animals, they need nutrition to live and build their reefs. Corals can get their nutrition in two different ways. So we saw their tentacles earlier, the little fluffy polyps sticking out of the coral skeleton. And with those tentacles, they can capture plankton that are swimming by. And they actually have tiny stinging cells, these little harpoons that you see here, that they can shoot out from their tentacles. And that helps stun prey and bring them into their mouth. And these stinging cells are called nematocysts. And have any of you been stung by a jellyfish before? Mm-hmm. Probably a bunch of you. Yeah, jellyfish also have these stinging cells, nematocysts. The ones that coral have are really, really tiny, because the coral animal is so small. So if you touch a coral, you're not going to get stung, but a tiny little zooplankton will. And then they can use those barbs to bring the plankton into their mouths. But the polyps also have little bits of algae that live inside of them. These brown things that you see inside of the coral tentacle. And these algae are plants. So that, that's where River was mentioning that the coral is kind of like a plant, an animal, and a rock all at the same time, because the coral animal has this plant living inside of it. And what do plants do? They photosynthesize. So these plants use sunlight to produce nutrients that the coral needs to survive. And sometimes we call these algae zooxanthellae. So that's a term that you guys might have heard. So the coral needs nutrition to help build up a reef. And the algae takes in sunlight and it photosynthesizes. And some of the byproducts of photosynthesis are sugars and nutrition that the algae uses, but it produces enough extra that it can give some to the coral that it's living inside of. And the coral, it uses those sugars and nutrition to build that hard skeleton. And that skeleton provides the home that the algae lives in. If the algae was just floating around in the water, these tiny, tiny algae, it wouldn't be very effective for them to take up sunlight. So they really like living inside of the coral. They can suck up all that sun and make lots of nutrition. But coral are really fragile animals because they depend on this relationship with algae and because they take so long to grow. Corals can take hundreds of years to reach the colonies that we see out on the reef. So it's really important to understand what hurts corals. So do you guys have any ideas of what some things that might hurt corals? I can take some hands here. Yeah, in the back? Climate change. That's a big one. Tourists. How do tourists hurt coral? They step on them. That's a big one. Yep. Pollution. These are all. I have all of these things on my slides. We're going to get to them. Go ahead. Coral bleaching. Yeah, related to climate change. Yep. In the back. Chemicals. Yeah. So as we said, corals are really, really delicate. So if you step on the corals, not just tourists, but sometimes we do it by accident too. Sometimes if it's a rough day, you lose your balance. If you step on those coral, it can cause breakage. And some types of coral, they can reattach themselves after they're broken, but especially the keiki coral really can't stand being stepped on. So when you're out on the reef, remember that the reef is really delicate and try whenever you can to not step on the coral. Another thing that we see here pretty commonly is anchor damage from corals. So an anchor can weigh hundreds of pounds. And if you get your anchor caught on one coral colony, it can destroy hundreds of years of progress that coral made to grow. So we're going to talk about this at the end, but Malamakai has made some really huge progress in getting us away from anchors. Yeah.
Turbidity and algae blooms.
Sure, absolutely, and that's related to pollution, as we mentioned before. Just while we're on physical damage, lost fishing gear can be a huge problem. You know, fishing is really important to our community, but if you lose your net, it can go get tangled on the reef. And not only is that going to cause physical damage to the coral, if that net gets wrapped around a coral and then waves are tugging at it, that can break the coral. But it's also going to hurt the fish that are in that, living inside of that coral. They can get trapped in there. Sunscreens can be really problematic for coral as well, and that's part of why Hawaii has banned sunscreens that we know have harmful chemicals. One of the things that we see, especially in North Kona, is we see problems with sedimentation. So as Kater mentions, the connectivity of Mauna to Makai is so important here in Hawaii because we see so much dirt and dust moving from the ridge onto the reef. So areas where there used to be native plants, but those have been removed, all of that dirt and dust from our cars that's getting blown in from Mauna Kea, that's all just going to go right onto the reef. And that's a real problem for the corals because it can just smother them. Their algae needs to see the sun in order to photosynthesize. But if they have dirt and dust lying on top of the coral, then they're not going to be able to photosynthesize. As we had some people mention, pollution is a huge problem. In some areas in Hawaii, our wastewater gets onto the reef, and that can make the corals sick, and it also increases turbidity of the water. And when the water becomes more turbid, again, the algae can't see. They're not able to photosynthesize as effectively, and it's going to start suffocating the coral. Same with trash. A lot of these things are just choking the coral at a really small scale. If you put a piece of trash wrapped around a coral, not enough oxygen is going to get to that animal. Just like us, the coral needs oxygen exchange. So if there's trash wrapped around our coral, then they're not going to be able to get that oxygen. And then crown of thorns starfish we commonly see here. And do you guys know what crown of thorns eat? I can just yell it out. They eat coral. But crown of thorns are native here. They're a normal part of our ecosystem. But crown of thorns can become a problem when all of these other stressors are happening at the same time. So even natural stressors from the coral can become a problem when they happen at the same time as these other stressors. And climate change is a really good example of that. We've always had hot summers here in Hawaii. And the problem with hot summers is that when the water gets really hot, the algae that lives inside of the coral starts to produce a poison for the coral. It starts to produce what's called reactive oxygen species, which are little loose bits of oxygen that cause damage on a microscopic level to the coral. So the coral says, I don't like that, and it ejects the algae out of its tissues. And what happens when the coral loses its algae? It's going to lose that color, so that's what we call it coral bleaching. The coral turns completely white without that algae to give it its pigments. And it's no longer going to be able to get that nutrition that the algae is bringing in from photosynthesis. So this is what a healthy antler coral looks like. You know, it's got a happy little hawkfish in there. It's brown. Most of our coral species here are pretty brown. But when that coral bleaches, this coral on the left here is actually still alive. It's kind of a naked coral. It doesn't have algae inside of it. And if that coral if the temperatures don't drop and the coral can't recover its algae, that coral is going to starve. And eventually, once that coral starves, it'll start to look like this. This is the dead coral that has been overgrown with limu. And one of the reasons I mention this as a natural stressor that has kind of gone out of whack, it has gotten out of sync with the coral, is we've always had hot summers, but the problem is these summers are getting longer and they're getting hotter and more frequent. So it used to be maybe we had a really hot summer every decade or so, and the corals would have some time to rehabilitate, to get better from that stress event. But now it's almost every summer is getting hotter and hotter. Here in Hawaii, we are lucky because we have ocean currents that bring us cold water, but that won't be true forever. So we need to prepare for a future in which our corals are going to be experiencing these stresses. And unfortunately, when corals experience these stresses, it's not just the individual colony that is impacted. We're looking at a picture of Kealakekua here. We can see my picture's pretty bad quality, but you can see we've got lots of lobe coral here making up a lot of the reef structure. So that's building that structurally complex reef that the fish are going to live on. And watch these two cauliflower coral here as our benchmarks. After a bleaching event, all of the lobe coral died. So this is the skeleton that's left over of that lobe coral, but there's no tissue left on it. And these cauliflower coral, the skeletons are still here, but everything else around that, where the lobe coral died, the reef completely eroded. The reefs are fighting a constant battle against the ocean to stay alive. You know, we talked about there's so much wave action here. If the coral's not constantly growing, it's going to start losing. So those coral are fighting a lifelong battle, and we need to figure out a way to help them out. And unfortunately, these stressors are just continuing to get worse. We know that climate change is real. Ocean temperatures are getting hotter. So we want to make sure that we can prepare our reefs to tolerate these future stressors. But the good thing is that coral have traits within them that can make them more tolerant of environmental stressors. So, you know, we're all humans. We all have different things that we're good at. Coral have traits within them that might help them perform better in response to climate change. The color's a little washed out here, but we have many corals of the same species here, but some that survived in response to the bleaching event, some that are still dark that have their algae. And that may be that these corals have something in their DNA that makes them stronger. But coral that have experienced past stress also tend to do stronger. If you guys have had maybe, you know, you've experienced a lot of stress in your childhood, you're going to grow up stronger because you've lived through that adversity. And coral are just the same way. Coral that have lived in areas where the temperature changes a lot day to day, maybe areas where there's lots of groundwater coming in, those coral have been proven to be stronger against climate threats. So we can identify these traits in coral and use them for our restoration efforts. We also know that some types of algae are stronger against climate change. So we can breed coral that might have those types of algae that can resist bleaching events. And also all of these other stressors that we talked about, pollution, people stepping on the coral, all of these other environmental factors stress out the coral and can make the impacts of bleaching worse. But the good thing is, you know, it's really hard for us to control climate change, each one of us individually. But these other stressors that compound bleaching are things that we can control in our everyday lives. So that's really important for us to work on. Well, one of the things that I do is I try to understand how the diversity of a community helps them resist in the face of climate change. So if we look at a community that's what we would call a monoculture community on the left, where it's all just one type of coral, compared to a community on the right where there's many different types, which one of these communities is going to do better when there's a stressor? It's probably going to be the community on the right, because if this one type of coral, this dark red on the left, if that's a really weak coral in response to warm oceans and that one dies, that whole community on the left is going to be wiped out, whereas only a few individuals in the community on the right will die. Diversity provides that functional redundancy, gives us lots of different traits that might perform well against different stressors. Even within us, we're all the same species, but we have very different genetic makeup that might make us good at different things. Some of us, maybe we're more resistant to COVID and we never got sick, but maybe we get the common cold every year. It's important to have these different traits within our community so that we can tolerate lots of different types of stressors. And just like with humans, we know that within the same species of coral, there's different traits that help them perform better. So these are all corals of the same species right next to each other, where one coral stayed strong while the ocean got warmer in one summer. These are pictures from Morea. But these colonies completely bleached, while this one stayed healthy. So we know this variation exists. So one of the things I do is I actually bring corals from the ocean onto land. I bring them to the nursery just next door, and we stress test them to figure out which ones are stronger. So one of the cool things about coral is we can break off a small piece of that coral, and just like a gecko regrowing its tail, it's not going to mind having lost that piece. So I can take a small piece of coral and stress test that piece and figure out whether the whole colony is a strong individual. So this is an experiment I ran back in Florida. You can see 3 different individuals of the same species exposed to the same high water temperature. And this coral did way better. It kept all of its algae. It stayed healthy even in the face of ocean warming. So this coral is kind of like a super coral that we might want to use to restore the reefs. So if we find certain individuals that can resist bleaching, we want to introduce those into our community. And one of the ways that we can do this is harnessing a really cool feature of coral that allows us to essentially clone them. So if we take a big colony, we can cut it into smaller pieces, and then we can use those corals, we can put them on small plugs next to each other, and they'll actually recognize their clones and refuse back to each other. So we call these fragments. We're doing some of it here at the nursery, but this is a very big focus in Florida where coral cover is super, super low. So these coral will actually just grow very quickly back into each other. And it's kind of like when you if you get a cut on your arm, your skin cells are going to divide more quickly. You're triggering meiosis, you're triggering cell division of that wound. So you're going to kickstart that response in the coral and get them to grow faster. And this process allows us to plant corals that we might know are stress tolerant back out onto the reef, and they'll refuse back together and grow a big colony in just a few years. We're essentially kickstarting that growth that can normally take hundreds of years if left to proceed naturally out in the ocean. So this is just one tool that we have in our pocket to increase more stress resilience out on the reef. Another really important tool that I'm not going to talk to you about today, but Dr. Robin Smith, I'm sure, could talk to you about if you have questions, is producing coral babies. So we have parent corals that we might know are more stress tolerant. We can also make keiki coral here on land and introduce those babies back onto the reef. And then we've created a whole new generation of stress tolerant corals. So we can use our nursery outside to raise those parents, stress test them, and then raise the next generation. So there's lots of different traits that we might try to choose that would help our corals survive out on the reef. Bleaching is just one of those traits. There's lots of other things that can help corals perform well on the reef. We are obviously interested in corals that are bleaching tolerant, but we also care about corals that just grow really fast. Corals that can help restore areas that were heavily degraded by storms. We care about corals that are good at making babies. That's just going to rapidly increase the number of keiki corals that we have out on the reef, and that's going to help increase coral cover. And we also might care about corals that are resistant to sicknesses. We know we have some chemicals in our water coming from wastewater and pollution, and that can make corals sick. So we're interested in coral that might be resistant to those sicknesses as well. But this is, only one part of the solution. We all need to take a role in responding to degradation of our coral reefs. We also need to malama our fish and our limu, which are so important for maintaining the reef ecosystem. So that's what I wanted to end on today. Is my job is to find coral that are super strong against climate change. But my job's not going to work unless we maintain all of these other aspects of the ecosystem. We all have to work together to take care of the reef. We've talked about how baby coral are especially vulnerable to damage from standing on. So next time you guys are out on the reef, make sure that you look like this underwater. We don't want your fins to be touching the coral. We don't want your hands to be touching the coral. These coral are very valuable, very, very vulnerable, especially when they're very small. And another thing I mentioned is anchor damage causes a lot of stress to corals and completely destroy a reef that has taken hundreds of years to grow. So next time you guys are out on a boat with your family, make sure you're hooking up to mooring lines. And this is one of the initiatives that Malama Kai has pioneered, is getting these mooring lines set up and maintained so that we have options. We don't just have to anchor on a coral. We always try to make sure that you're anchoring on sand if you have to anchor, and try to choose mooring lines to protect our coral. And we talked about how there's some options for sunscreen that are better for coral. They don't have the harmful chemicals, but really the best thing that you can do for corals is to cover up. Instead of slathering yourself with sunscreen, if you've got that thick layer of even reef-safe sunscreen, that's probably not going to be super good for coral when you have so many people in small areas. So when you can, try to cover up as much as possible, wear a hat, wear a sun shirt. How many of you here like to fish? Yeah, me too. Fishing is awesome, but we have to be conscious about what kinds of fish we're taking and what size of fish. So uhu here, parrotfish, they're kind of like the lawnmowers of the reef. So this parrotfish is eating the big algae that can compete with the coral on the reef. And if we remove all of the little fish from the reef, they're never going to grow up big and strong and make babies. So we want to make sure that we're not taking fish that are too small so that they have time to reproduce. So that's why there's new fishing regulations. It is really important to follow these, reduce the number of fish that you're taking, and make sure that you're only taking fish that are big enough to have already reproduced. And as we talked about earlier, keep your fishing gear in check. It may seem really minor if you lose your net sometimes, but if you're able to be conscious of that and not lose your net, it's not going to end up choking out a coral out on the reef. And even the little fish, we've got manini and kole, these are really important as well. They get the stuff that the uhu can't get, the small algae. They're kind of like the janitors of the reef. They're going up or like street sweepers almost. They're going up and getting the stuff that the uhu can't get. So we want to follow regulations for all of the different species, not just the big fish. We can also control how much plastic ends up out on the reef, which is, see here, you can see that the plastic is all tangled up with the limu. and it can end up hurting the fish as well and the honum. For me, I see a lot of this. If you ever see someone who's got their trash loose in their truck bed, this is a really simple solution. A lot of that trash can end up blowing when you're driving down the highway. You might not even realize that your trash is blowing out. So really simple solutions that can make a big impact. If we cover up our trash in our trucks, that trash isn't going to end up out in the ocean. But also we can do little things to help clean up the trash that's already there. Next time you guys go to the beach, even if it's just one piece of trash and you pick that up, that trash probably would have ended up out on the reef. We know everything moves out onto the reef. So all of the trash that you produce, try to keep it with you, try to make sure it's disposed of properly. Otherwise it may end up out on our coral. And a little bit goes a long way. All of these things are just little changes you can make in your life that can help protect the coral. But I'm really excited to hear about everything that you guys have been working on to characterize. I've seen some really cool posters trying to understand different water chemistry parameters that are important for the reef. So I'm really excited for what you guys are working on, and thank you guys so much for having me. And we were already behind schedule, so now we're going to more behind schedule.
So no, you did great.
We'll be able to adjust.
Yes.
Does anyone have questions? River.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but you said that the coral expels the zooxanthellae. Isn't it unknown on what expels what or what leaves what?
River, you're absolutely right. It is something that is really difficult to characterize. There have been some corals where it has been shown that they do eject the algal symbiont. There's some corals where it appears that the coral digests the symbiont, so it seems like it might be species dependent. But we do know that the algae is producing something that the coral can't tolerate. I removed it from this presentation, but there are videos of the coral actually kicking out. You can see it coming off. You can see the algae coming off the coral. So it is species dependent, and you're right, there is still work that needs to be done on that.
Can you just repeat his question and the other questions?
River's question was, he said that I mentioned that the coral expel the algae living inside of them, and he pointed out that that's still under research. We aren't fully sure that that's what happens. It does for sure happen in some coral species, but we don't know that all coral species actually eject their algae. Some of them might eat it. So it's something that we're still working to understand. When we think about the evolutionary history of corals, we are more related to a banana than some species of coral are to each other. So just looking at one species of coral doesn't tell us about all of the different types of coral there are out there. I think I saw that hand first.
When you do the testing on the coral, like what exactly do you do, like to make the cell is stronger?
Sure. Yeah, the question was how exactly I stress test the corals. How do I figure out which ones are stronger? Unfortunately, it really means exposing the corals to a bleaching event. So I take a piece of coral, like I said, it's kind of like removing the gecko's tail. The coral will regrow. But that piece of coral that I remove, I'm going to treat it like it's experiencing a bleaching event. So I put it in a tank and I heat that tank up to temperatures that the coral can experience during a bleaching event. So I bring them out into the nursery and we essentially put a aquarium heater in those tanks, and we bring the temperature up slowly to simulate a normal, temperature doesn't go from normal to boiling hot overnight. So we slowly bring the temperature up. And then some of the things we look at are which corals die first. Do some corals ever recover from bleaching? Some corals might bleach, but they are able to, we talked about how the bleaching is when the algae is gone, but the coral is still alive. So some coral are actually able to recover from bleaching. So we look at things like time to bleaching and time to recovery, and we look at lots of different chemical aspects of the coral and biological aspects. And that helps us figure out which ones are stronger against which ones are resistant to bleaching and which ones can recover better, which are both important traits. Yep.
Have you found a coral that can recover from stress?
So the question was whether we found corals that can recover from stress. Not here yet. Our program here is still very new. I only moved here about 1.5 years ago, and we only opened the nursery last summer. So actually this summer we're kicking off a lot of our stress testing work here in Hawaii, but in Florida, I was able to identify corals that can recover from bleaching. And the trick with that is some stress studies, it's tempting to kind of cook your corals and get a response really quickly. But if you are able to, you have the time and the patience to simulate a stress event slowly, then you can get your corals to actually persist through. It's not common. Most of the corals get stressed out and do die. But I have had several corals back in my work in Florida where they were able to reacquire their algae from the water and go back to being healthy, which is a super cool thing to see. That's the species I worked with there was staghorn coral, Acrophora silvicornis. It's historically one of the most dominant species in Florida. And one of the things that's really interesting about working here is there's been very little work done on most of the species that we have. A lot of the work in Hawaii has been done just by HIMB. And they work in a very narrow location, and even the same species between the two islands sometimes behaves really differently. So we have a lot of questions of how corals respond to stress here. So stay tuned, and hopefully I'll have an answer for you next summer. Yep.
Is this restoration project similar or connected to the one in Kaneohe Bay?
So I think everyone heard that one. I won't repeat it. So the restoration work in Kaneohe Bay is, I think there's two different projects, Kuleana Corals and Restore with Resilience. So I think both of those groups are working with HIMB to identify corals that are strong against stress tolerance. So it's a very similar principle. You find corals that are strong against these, particularly climate change, and plant them back out onto the reef. Those projects are working almost exclusively with fragmenting corals and putting them back on the reef. Our program is actually more focused on making baby corals. We're still, reproduction work is still pretty new here, especially with some of the species that are very susceptible to bleaching. So maybe you guys heard, like Ka'aluu Bay closed a couple weeks ago for this species. We did see it spawn here this year, but we were not able to produce the next generation of corals. So hopefully next year. But yeah, so what we're doing that's a little bit different is focusing on that reproduction aspect as well. But the corals that I stress test this summer will eventually get planted. The survivors will get planted back out onto the reef. And so very similar principles in Kaneohe, different species. They mostly work with Montipora, and their corals are very different than what we have here. So similar principles. Yep.
How are the babies attached to the reef when you get them ready to go?
So coral babies initially are kind of like little jellyfish. They swim around for the first week or so of their life. I'm not the reproduction expert, so I'm looking at Robin. Okay. But initially they swim around and they use chemical cues to help them figure out where they're going to settle on the reef. So one of the cues is crustose coralline algae, or CCA. It's this like purple crusty stuff that you guys sometimes see on the reef. And that's an important cue for those swimming corals to stick onto the reef and start sheeting out. So they can't see, but they can sense where is going to be a good environment. And there's been some studies that showed that actually reef sounds can be important settlement cues, and we still don't even understand that. But yep, so they're swimming around. Different species have different durations that they can swim around for. And when they're initially eggs and sperm, the distance that those eggs and the gametes can be disseminated varies for each species. So yeah, and some corals actually release the larvae straight out of their polyps, fully grown, kind of like Venus coming out of the shell. So yeah, it's very species dependent, but they are swimming around like little jellyfish, and then they find a spot to latch out onto the reef.
Okay, we're out of time for questions. I'm sorry, but hopefully Dr. Klingus will stay around for lunch so people can ask questions. Will you be able to do that?
Sure.
Today? Okay.
So you can ask her more questions, or during the break. We're going to have a 5-minute break in a little bit, so you can ask her more questions. I know you're just a wealth of knowledge, so we appreciate your time. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for all the great questions. And also, Akuakoa has this the coral restoration. I don't know if she mentioned or pointed in that whole area right there. If you get a chance during lunch, maybe you can just peek over the fence and take a look at the coral nursery and where their research facility is. We couldn't do a tour today, unfortunately, because we're too big of a group, but it'd be great to come back. I know Kuma Austin would like to bring students back here to do tours, so we'll try to arrange that for next year. So I just want to give you an overview. What's the arrow key now? I have to use, what am I using to advance this? Oh, it does work? Okay. Okay, sorry. Okay. So So I just wanted to give you an overview. I'm going to be quick about this. I know you guys have been sitting for a while. The Bridge to Reef program consists of 4 or 5 main pieces. We have classroom visits, the number depending on the class and what we're doing, where students learn about their watershed in Ahupua'a and human impacts to their watershed in Ahupua'a. They have field trips, at least 3 for the whole school year, sometimes more, where they go to the Mauka, the Kula, which is the mid-region, and then the Makai section of their watershed. So they learn about different areas of their watershed. They spend time in that aina. They sometimes do stewardship work. They practice kilo, so they develop that relationship with their watershed in Ahupua'a. Then we have guest presenters, like partners, like some of you who are going to be introducing a little later, who come into the classroom, who share with them their mana'o about invasive species or about coral reefs or dryland forests. And then we also have presenters who come into the field, of course, when we take our huaka'i, our field trips. And then see, these are some of our partners who come and helped us. And then there's a stewardship project. So the students choose an environmental issue that is an issue that impacts their watershed. And then they choose a project to do about that issue. So the students are going to be sharing their presentations about their issues they chose and the projects that they wanted to focus on. And then we have a ho'ike, a sharing opportunity at school. All these schools are doing a ho'ike at school, and then in addition this year we're doing an all-school symposium like today. So that's the overview of the program. This is a slide we shared at our statewide BWET meeting. So we're funded by NOAA, the Bay Watershed Education Training Grant that Meheolani in the back there is our funder. So we're so grateful she's here today to see what we've been up to. But this is for 3 years what we accomplished. We reached 1,000 students. We worked with 16 teachers. We had 98 field experiences. So we really got students out in the AINA to learn and Hana stewardship, give back to our AINA as well. So lots of great opportunities in the last 3 years through our BWET funding. This year, we worked with 4 schools, 5 different grades, 5th through 8th graders, 333 students. What an auspicious number. 12 teachers and 5 aides, over 60 class visits amongst the 4 schools, 43 field trips. Woohoo! Just this year, stewardship projects, which we're going to hear about, 4 school-wide ho'ike, and then this one symposium today. Innovations is going to share later, so I'm just going to skip their slides. Pardon me. Waikoloa is also going to share, but I just wanted to give a little overview. Some of the class visits, some of our different presenting groups that came in, folks, DLNR, BISC, or Big Island Invasive Species. Miss Bailey, who I didn't introduce in the back with her baby Aya, was one of our teachers. So Miss Bailey, before she had her baby, was teaching the first few months of the school year. So she is awesome. And Miss Bailey was a 7th grade teacher at Waikoloa School last year. So Kumu Austin is the current 7th grade teacher, and Miss Bailey was in his position before she went on maternity leave. So we also adopted Ho'oko Park a few years ago. The whole school adopted this park, which is right next to the school in Waikoloa Village. And we planted 125 native plants, shrubs and ground cover, no trees allowed. But we've been maintaining it. It looks really good now from the rain, but it's been a really awesome project to get to work with the County Parks and Rec. Students have presented to younger students as well this year through their stewardship work, and they'll talk more about that. Okay, so that was, okay, then Huaka'i, we went on the same field trips with 5th and 7th grade. So the Waikoloa Dry Forest, Kalanamanu, which is up on the Saddle Road to Hilo. If you guys haven't been there, Bird Park, it's amazing. And this year we got to go to the 4 Seasons and learn about their fish ponds and coastal ecology there. We did water quality testing. They did a beach cleanup. It was a really cool new partnership. We did trail building. We did lots of cleanups. We did invasive species removal. We got to harvest tilapia, which the kids loved fishing. And then there's stewardship projects that you might see yourselves up here. So I know it's a very busy slide, but I'm just trying to get it all in there. So this was a symposium. We had about 200 people at White Below School. It was through K through 8. All the parents and families were invited. We provided pizza and food for everybody. And then, yeah, there you can see our invasive species removal. Shy is that surprise? That was like you. Shaylin, okay, great picture. Okay, and then you can see they're presenting to the 2nd and 3rd graders about overfishing, and then pollution, and then this is at the symposium. They had their posters there too. So anyway, just had to show that off. And then 5th grade, same Suakai, similar beach cleanup, and yeah, with 7th grade we did biodiversity transect surveys. With 5th grade we did kilo and drawing, so a little different activity in the forest. But and then their stewardship work, we had beach cleanup at Four Seasons, but then Nora, who's going to talk about it, organized her own beach cleanup. Woohoo! 5th grade. So we had beach cleanup down at the Puko Boat Ramp, partnered with Keep Puko Beautiful, which was an awesome partnership. We did a lot of cleaning up on campus. Campus is pretty trashy, so we need to do another cleanup. So there's always more work to be done. And then at their symposium, these are some of their posters that they made. And then this is them at Ho'oko Park cleaning up and doing some weeding and watering also there. So, okay. Oh, and collecting Ilima over there, Everett, and they're collecting Ilima seeds for the Waipilo Dry Forest to plant. Okay, Waimea Middle School, who unfortunately couldn't be here today. Miss Bowman's father passed away last week, so she's had a lot going on, their lead teacher. But I've been working with that school for many years, and they have a whole elective class called Going Native, and so they do a lot of native planting seeds, plants, and maintaining on campus. So you can see them planting seeds here. We've gone 3 times to the Kauai corridor, so the Kauai Tree Sanctuary on Kohala Mountain. So they are maintaining a lot of these native koa that were planted there on campus. We've had plantings that we keep adding to and maintaining that we're trying to grow forest there. Kaulana Manu also, and then this was when Hokulea was visiting. They came and the whole school got to go down and meet with the Hokulea crew and learn about living on the Va'a and what that whole life is like. So, and then Big Island Invasive Species Committee has come to all of our Waipilo and Waimea classes so students can learn about invasive species, in particular coconut rhinoceros beetle, which some of you are going to talk about. So, okay, so now we want to thank all of our partners and funders. And do you want to go ahead and start doing this?
Sure.
Yeah. And I promise.
Okay, well, we have quite a few partners and funders. We have, of course, our main funder, Noah Biwet and Healani. Can you stand up?
We're lucky because Healani lives in Hilo, but
Right.
she's a statewide coordinator for Noah Biwet, and so we're very grateful that you were able to join us today.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for all your support. We're going to keep our fingers crossed for future years.
Yes.
The ladies from Akahiao Nature Institute are here. If you didn't know, please stand up. Actually, all the funders and everyone with a lei, stand up. How about we do that?
So we
Partners, teachers, funders. Akahiao has taken over the area up here in North Kona, previously known or still known as Hui Hui Ranch, and so they have a nature program there. Great outlet for students to see what it looks like after cattle's been grazing on the slopes of Hualalai for many, many years, or bringing it back to a different state. So we were able to go up there and work with them.
Can you just raise your hand at Kahiao,
Oh, yeah.
folks?
Thank you. They're not here, but for some of you that do or don't know them, great team. They will come to schools and present and do education outreach. Waikoloa Dry Forest is not here, however, the students, oh, sorry, you are here?
I was basically, my husband is the natural resources manager,
Okay.
Rob.
Oh, you're
So I
Rob's
was
wife.
brought here
And of course, Noah with the BWAT program. Atherton Family Foundation, they're a quiet funder. We get a lot of our work through and grants through and work with them. And then Kahalua Kuaheva is not here. However, it is an organization, not-for-profit, that is stewarding, thank you. Stewarding in the upper Kahaluu watershed, Ahupua'a, so up on the mountain. You can look them up. Wonderful group that we've got to work with, HTA with there. Kohala Center goes without saying around the island, and we have Kahaluu education team from Kohala Center here. We got to go there as well. Kohani Iki, Malama Aikekai, and Kohani Iki Ohana Foundation, they're not here. However, anytime you go down to Kohani Iki or Pine Trees and you get to use the compass or the canoe garden, that's that group. And National Park Service, of course, with Kaloko Honokapa fish ponds, and of course, Malamakai. And if I missed anyone, apologies, but it takes a village. We are a village. Thank you, everyone, for investing in students' future and education.
Four Seasons Resort While Alive opened their arms to us this year for about 140 students basically, which is a lot for them for 5 different field trips. So that was really awesome. And also the state for allowing us to use Kalana Manu. And so anyway.
And we have Miss Rachel here with Innovations Public Charter, Miss Megan Lernan here with Hawaii Technology Academy.
Will you raise your hands?
Teachers,
Okay.
they're all.
We got Mari. Wait. We got Mari. We got Kuma Austin, 7th grade. We got Miss Souza, who's the STEM coordinator. Great.
You got it. And everyone that's here, thank you.
So, okay, so you guys, and parents for driving, because at Innovations and HTA, you guys have relied a lot on parents. So we really appreciate, and parents who are here today who drove your students, we really appreciate you. You are invaluable. We couldn't do this without you too. So, okay, so you guys, we're gonna take a quick 5-minute break. So bathrooms, food, and then come right back in, okay? So go ahead, take a quick break. So 10:15, be back by 10:15.